So I asked you the question about whether or not you were transitioning from a career or, starting back to school or whatever, because that's sort of how I ended up in academia, because I didn't actually start out with the intentions of going into university. So I want to give you just a little bit of background sort of to get to where I am now. In Canada, I grew up in a very small province called Prince Edward Island. Anybody heard of Anne of Green Gables?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Well, that's where I grew up. Wasn't as good as the fictional thing, but it was pretty close. So it had a population of 145,000, very small. That 145,000 now. So this is 30 years I was growing up there. So it probably was about 120. The only way to get off or on was by ferry. So we're very sort of isolated from the rest of the mainland. So my goal in life was to get off the island. So we did have a university, and I was trying to decide if I wanted to go to university and take 4 years, or I wanted to do journalism, which I actually was interested in being a reporter. So we had a journalism program also on the island that was 1 year. And so I went to the interview for the journalism school, and I talked to the instructor, and I said, "You have on-the-job training?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Can you get me off the island?" And he said, "Yes." So I decided to go into journalism. And I absolutely I never regret that decision whatsoever, because it really it shaped who I am as an academic, and I'll come back to that. So I decided to go into journalism, and I did get on-the-job training. And he sent me to a place on the mainland, which was in the closest province, which was New Brunswick. And I ended up in a town called, the region was called the Myrnas, but it was made up of Newcastle, Chatham, and Douglastown, so 3 smaller areas. Very blue-collar, mill workers, fishermen. And it was a place that they actually referred to at the time that I landed there as a small town with a big city mentality in terms of the crime rate. So there was a lot of alcoholism, there was a lot of unemployment. So as a junior reporter, and I was 19 at the time, so remember we graduated in Canada, in the province that I grew up in, when you were 18, and so I had a year program, so I was about 19 when I was getting there. And I really got there in the heyday of what a budding criminologist would feel, because there was just a whole spat of crime and a series of very serious homicides. So there was 3 sort of experiences that moved me towards academia. And 2 of them I'm going to talk about, which were related to 2 of the crimes that occurred there. And then one was a more personal one related to who my mentor was when I was there. So remember, I'm a junior reporter, which I should be covering tea parties and church bazaars. But I got there and there was 5 homicides in a 6-month period. And so the paper that I was at, we had what they called community newspapers at that point. So it was published twice a week. They had 1 crime reporter, a female who was just wonderful, and so she covered the first homicide. And what happened was there was 3 perpetrators who were eventually convicted of killing an elderly shopkeeper and sexually assaulting and beating his elderly wife, but she survived, so it was just 1 homicide. One of the individuals, his name was Alan Legier. He was kind of the older of the offenders. The other 2, Todd Matchett and Scott Curtis, were younger. They were kind of early 20s, but Alan was about, I think he was his mid-30s. So they were convicted of second-degree murder. So when Alan was in prison, serving his life sentence, he developed an ear infection in 1989, and they were transferring him from the prison where he was being housed to a local hospital to get treated for the ear infection, and he escaped. And in the 7-month manhunt in which they looked for him, they started referring to him as the monster of the Myrnas, and he's actually one of the most notorious serial killers in Canada right now. And he's still living in a supermax prison in Quebec, which is one of the provinces in Canada. So in the 7 months, he committed 4 more murders, arson and rape, before being recaptured. And so they eventually did get him. And when I had lived in and took pictures of him when he was going into the courthouse while my colleague, the crime reporter Bonnie, was covering the trial. So for that 2 years, that was my only exposure to his particular trial and crimes, except for all the discussion and the media coverage. I then moved 3 years later and was in Ontario when he got free, and actually lived in fear that he might remember me. This is like the kind of things that go through your mind when stuff like this happens, I guess. At the time, my editor and a CBC journalist, or the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation journalist, wrote a book called Terror, Murder and Panic in New Brunswick that describes the events in detail. And if you read any material about him, they don't know whether to define him as a spree killer or a serial killer, because there was a spat of killings, but then there was sort of a calm down period, so they're not really quite sure, but they have some debates about it. One of the reasons that, and actually this, I should mention, this was the first Canadian case that used DNA fingerprinting to convict him. So it was the first Canadian case where DNA actually led to a conviction. But the reason why it had sort of an impact on me was because he was a person that had worked out at the gym, the same gym that we all had worked out at. He was known for he was a bouncer at a local pub and known for protecting women when men were getting too friendly and stuff like that. And my partner, who was my boyfriend at the time and is now my husband, he grew up in this area. And he said he vividly remembers being beaten up by bullies at school and Alan coming over and intervening and then picking him up and brushing him off and apologizing for it. So I started to realize at that point, he was called the monster of the Miramichi, but no one really knew that this was the type of individual that would eventually come to play in his life. And afterwards we heard stories about in the full moon his hair became more curly and all that kind of stuff, but no one said any of that beforehand. So then my second experience related to another homicide that happened after that, and that was Earl Lewis. And so again, I'm a junior reporter. Bonnie, the crime reporter, is still covering the trial for Alan and his two co-offenders. And Earl Lewis commits a homicide and they need someone else. And so the only person they have is me, which was fantastic. I was thrilled. So I was going to get to cover a murder trial. So I was fresh out of school, never did it before. And I think, I think about this a lot. I think back to how naive I was. I didn't think about theory and research that I think about now. I was just, wow, I'm going to cover a murder trial and I can tell my friends at home. And it was probably one of the most defining moments for me because of what sort of transpired. So the way we did murder trials back then, because everyone wanted to read about it and the papers were sold out at the end of every day, is you sat in the courtroom and you took everything down verbatim and then you wrote it verbatim in the newspaper. Like there was no sort of synopsis, everything was put in. So I sat there for 3.5 weeks, listened to everything, and Earl Lewis killed another man about his age. They were both in their mid-30s, and it was your typical male-on-male alcohol drunken brawl. So at the end of the trial in 1987, he was convicted of second-degree murder, which in Canada is considered to be a murder with intent, but not premeditated, and it comes with a minimum mandatory sentence of 10 years and a maximum of 25 years. So in the courtroom, the Crown prosecutor requested that the maximum parole eligibility period should be 25 years. And in hindsight, I realized that was quite significant given the circumstances of the crime. When Lewis, the offender, was asked by the judge if he had anything he wanted to say, he reported, I agree with Mr. Ferguson, who was the Crown attorney. I probably do deserve 25 years in my opinion. And if that's the case, I guess I'll have to do it. So the judge sentenced him to actually 20 years. The Crown wanted 25. The offender said, I think I deserve 25. The judge gave him 20. As Lewis was leaving the courthouse, we were all outside, and one reporter asked him if he was disappointed that he didn't get 25 years. Not the brightest question. But he actually said it wouldn't have mattered too much. And I recall thinking to myself, I think it would matter to me. Like 5 years, he's in his mid-30s, so he would have been mid-50s when he came out. So 5 years would have made a difference to me. And I wondered why it wouldn't have mattered to him. Several weeks later, I actually got a letter from him complimenting me on my coverage, which it was very bizarre because every second word was Myrna in the letter. He kept repeating my name, but it was to compliment the coverage. And he told me in the letter, and this is when I started to realize that I had no concept of really anything when it comes to understanding why people commit certain crimes. He said in the letter that he spent 29 of his 41 years, so he was 40. I guess he was late 30s when he was in trial. So 29 of his 41 years in one institution or another, including some of his early years which were spent in reform schools, so schools at that time for delinquent youth or people that were getting in trouble with the law. He was released in prison in 1985, which was the year that he actually perpetrated the homicide trial that I covered, after spending 12 years incarcerated for an earlier manslaughter conviction. And he concluded his letter by writing, and I think this is so astute of someone who had very minimal education, not with the best grammar, but whatever. I think of a poem I seen one time. Walls and bars do not make a prison. How many people in the community are in their own self-made prisons on the outside? Be it self-made or a way of life they cannot seem to change out of. I think if you took a poll, it would be quite a few. So at that point I realized when he said to the reporter outside that it didn't really matter to him, he already felt like he was in an institution. He didn't really feel it made any difference if he was inside or the outside. And he talked about after being his first manslaughter conviction, being let out and having $500 in his pocket, and he said, I wasn't prepared to live on the outside because he didn't have the skills to live on the outside, and at this point he didn't have any training. So I think I realized very much at that point that journalists, and I'm not actually sure you can say anything different today, we don't really report with any context. We sit and we sort of ask questions, and we take in the responses that people do give us, not very critically for the most part. And I think there's a lot of really good things that journalists do, so I'm not sort of dissing the profession. But I think when it comes to understanding crime and criminals and violence, I think they really don't provide a lot of context for the general public to understand and make informed decisions. So regardless of why he wrote the letter, it had a big impact on me in terms of starting to get a little bit frustrated with my career, sort of not being happy with what I was doing and feeling like I wanted to do something different. So that was sort of the two experiences that framed my interest in violence more generally. So the third experience, which was more personal in nature, had to do with the crime reporter that I was talking about, the female crime reporter. So when I came for my on-the-job training, I was there for a month, and I lived with this female crime reporter who I thought was ancient at the time. She was probably my age now. But not to sort of insult her, but she looked like a wizened up little old crone. And she would say that herself. She drank excessively, and she smoked excessively, and she swore, and she was your prototypical crime reporter, but she was a female. Usually you see men in those roles. So I lived with her and her family. She had 4 kids, and I lived with them for a month. And then when I left and finished my course, and then I got a full-time job, I came back and lived with her for a period of time until I got my own place. So she had a daughter that was my age. And one night, the two of us were out at a bar drinking, which is what a lot of people did in this town, including the reporters. And Randa, her daughter, got up and went to the phone, and she came back. She said, I have to go to the hospital. Dad threw Mom down the stairs. He's at it again. So this woman, who was a crackerjack reporter, who just, she had been my mentor, had been living with this man who had abused her their whole life together. The kids all knew it. Everybody knew it. I had no inkling. I had never been exposed to anything like that growing up. I now know that it was all around me. I just didn't see it necessarily because no place is actually, it's not absent from it. So I was shocked. And I think, also at the time during my on-the-job training, she had given me a book about a woman who had written a life story about her life up until she had killed her husband. So it was a book written by another woman, and she had given me this book and said, read this. This is really interesting. And so this is the woman that's currently living with an abusive partner, who was an alcoholic. I probably think they both were. I went into work the next day, and everybody knew. She was in the hospital. She broke her arm when she fell down the stairs. Everybody said, yeah, we know. That's Bonnie and Kenny. And no one did anything. I remember this is 30 years ago, and I didn't do anything, and I think I constantly feel guilty about that. But I was, 19 and 20, and so what was I going to do if no one who had lived with her for that long had done anything? And she came back to work, and no one ever spoke about it again. So I think I had an interest in violence, and that really sort of honed in on sort of where I wanted to sort of put my attention in terms of helping women who may want to leave a relationship like that, or helping them if they want to negotiate living in a relationship like that, so there's supports and stuff available. So at that point I was totally dissatisfied with my work, and we had decided to move from the eastern part of Canada to Ontario into Toronto, which I'm sure most of you have probably heard of. And so I decided to go back to school then. So I did my bachelor's in sociology and law and society. So I would have had a program probably somewhat similar to the program here, because we had political science courses, psych courses and stuff like that, sociology, and history. So we had sort of a variation of different courses. So I did my BA, which was 4 years, and then I did my master's and my PhD at the University of Toronto in sociology. And so here I think my first sort of thing, if you're thinking about, doing your honors or moving into graduate work, a piece of advice that I sort of say with a bit of a caveat, don't let yourself get exploited. But if there's ever an opportunity to volunteer or ever an opportunity, just grab it. Because I think that is one of the best ways that you're going to find out what you want to do, because you can get some actual hands-on experience doing research. And I say that because I had a volunteer position that I'm going to talk about, and then I had an opportunity present itself that myself and another student, when we were in our graduate years, latched onto. And those two things are still core research streams for me in terms of the research that I do. So the first one, so to backtrack a little bit, I'm fourth year BA, and I'm working at an espresso bar to make some extra money. And I have this interest in violence against women. And there's a group of women that come in from this hoity-toity shop just above me, that we're in the basement, that come in on their breaks. And so I got to know them quite well. If you work in an espresso bar, the people come in regularly, you get to know them quite well. And so this one morning I came into work, and these three women were crying. And I said, "What's going on?" And they said, "Carmela's dead." And I said, "Well, what happened?" And they said, "Her husband killed her." And this was a woman. They were mid. See, it's all distorted because I was younger. I want to say they were in their mid-30s. They traveled. They went on vacations. They had made a choice not to have children. So they seemed to have this very active, amazing lifestyle from a younger person that was sort of looking. So he killed her, and he was convicted of first-degree murder. And that started to spark my interest in a class that I was taking at the time called Women in the Criminal Justice System. And it was about women working in the criminal justice system, but also about women as victims and offenders. And so I came across a report by a woman at the University of Toronto called Rosemary Gartner, who became my dissertation, my PhD supervisor. And I thought, this is exactly what I want to do for work, for my project. So I applied to U of T, and then I called her up, and I said, "Do you have any work that you want someone to do? I'm free, basically, take me, I'm yours." And she did. She had a project called Intimate Femicide in Ontario. So she was documenting over a 20-year period all the women who were killed, and then of that proportion, all the women who were killed by their intimate male partners, to see if there was differences between those killings and the killings of women who were not in a relationship with their partners. So for a period of a year, I traveled around with Rosemary and Maria Crawford, who was the community person who was involved in this research, because the research was spearheaded by a group of women called Women We Honor Action Committee, which was a group that was responsible or worked in shelters where 8 women had actually been killed, and so they wanted this research done. So we went through Crown files and police reports and all this data, hard copy files that we coded into coding sheets to enter into a data set so we could look at trends and patterns over time. And this was an amazing experience because not only did I get to meet a lot of police and crowns and stuff that I would later then touch base with when I started my own research, but it also served as the starting point for a piece of research that I continue to do called Homicide and Justice in Ontario. So I have now started with that material. And that was one of the conditions of my free labor, so don't give yourself away totally free, was that I could use the data. And she agreed to that. So right now I have over 40 years of data for Ontario, in which we have collected, myself and now some undergraduate and graduate students that work with me. There's about 8,500 cases in it of homicides that have occurred over the 40-year period. And primarily I've been focusing on the criminal justice response to these. And I've been very much interested in the concept of intimacy and how intimacy is constructed in the courts in terms of usually leading to a more lenient sentence as opposed to a more serious sentence, which I think might be more applicable, but I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know for sure. But the data set has a wealth of information that some of my students are now using for different questions. So they're looking at age disparity in homicide. They're looking at sentencing in gun homicides versus non-gun homicides. There's one looking at police-perpetrated homicides and the role of mental health. So it's a huge data set that has a lot of information. So that one volunteer experience sort of led to the beginning of that, the development of relationships that I needed to continue that, and then the current research that I'm actually doing. The second thing that came across my plate was in the late 1990s in Ontario. They have what's called specialized domestic violence courts. You actually have a pilot just starting here in Southport, which is the first pilot in Queensland for a specialized domestic violence court. So in Toronto, we had our first 2 specialized pilots in the late 1990s, and a consulting firm from Ottawa was looking for some students to work with them, and he was going to pay us to collect data and stuff like that. So myself and another graduate student volunteered to do this for pay. But then we also said, we're students, we would really like to have the data from this afterwards. And he was a consultant and he didn't really care. The ministry that we were working through said, that's fine. So we got an agreement in place. And so we did actually get access to the data, and we continue to use it to publish. So that entailed going into 2 courthouses in Toronto. There was the 2 pilots were early intervention. So offenders who commit domestic violence against a partner who was a first-time offender, didn't use a weapon, and there was no serious injury. So they were allowed to do a plea and go through treatment. And then we had another pilot with enhanced prosecution, which meant that they didn't want to plea or it was too serious for them to plea. They wanted enhanced prosecution, which meant videotape recordings of the victim testimony, medical reports, and that sort of thing. So we conducted most of the data collection for the consultant in Ottawa by just going through, again, hard copy files. And I don't really know if this is any different today. I think that still we go through hard copy files, and we all think that everything is electronic, but not in the courts in Canada. And sometimes I really don't think you get the best data from electronic data that's been inputted by a court system anyway, because you get the real nitty-gritty, messy stuff in the hard copy files when you're going through them, even though it is a bit more time-consuming. So we finished that work, and then we started publishing from that, and then we applied for funding to continue to look at specialized domestic violence courts in Canada, and we continue to do that as well. And I belong to a group called the Canadian Observatory on the Justice System Response to Intimate Partner Violence, which actually we have an Australian partner, Paul Mazerolle. We have some Australian partners and US partners and UK partners. So those 2 things, that volunteer opportunity and then just latching on, as a graduate student, I needed extra money anyway, we usually do, so it was nice to have this opportunity present itself to do research and then to actually make money. But the lessons that I learned in terms of what was involved in data collection itself, a lot of people, I do what's called quantitative work, and a lot of people who don't do quantitative work seem to think that all I do is crunch numbers and I just get stats from someplace and I never have to do anything with it, but really there are secondary data sets, but primary data collection is hard work and it's time consuming and it's resource intensive, but at the end of the day it's really rewarding when you get what you get.
Did you guys catch the difference between the secondary and the primary data? Because we talk about this in class and I don't know that students will grasp that.
Yeah, the secondary data is what's already there and the primary data is what you go into it as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess a good example, so I do secondary data analysis with data from StatsCan, so on various projects, and I'm limited to what they have decided or the way they measure variables and what they want to measure. With my primary data collection projects, we put variables in place and they've evolved over time as we've come into obstacles where there was things that weren't necessarily right with them and we didn't really like how it was measuring things, but we've been able to mold them as we go along, sort of documenting those decisions and making sure that we clarify how we change the measurement of stuff. But so that's one of the advantages of primary data collection is that you get to shape it as opposed to secondary data where it's already shaped and you really have to just deal with what you have. Is there any other questions on anything I said so far?
Just a question about the use of the data. From who gives you permission to use it and because in the subject argument where we have to do a research proposal of ethics and anonymity and permission from the participants, it was all very, very important.
Yeah.
So how does that sort of bear on secondary?
So that's a perfect segue into the challenges of that kind of research, which Dr. Eckerman wanted me to talk about. And the first one is building trust with those that you want data from and data access. So the short answer to that question is it takes a long time to get access, and sometimes you may actually end up not getting the access. So for the homicide work, Rosemary Gartner had already established a relationship with the coroner at the time. And so that was one of the relationships that I had mentioned I was able to sort of build upon when I got involved in that work, because I was the person then that ended up sitting in the coroner's office on a daily basis, going through the files and coding the information. So I got to know the data management person who was able to speak for me with the chief coroner. And so now, I've been collecting and working with the coroner's office for the past 20 years now. And right now they have what's called a Domestic Violence Death Review Committee. I don't know if you've heard about that. You have them here in Australia too. There are committees that get together to sort of a post-mortem on a domestic homicide that's already occurred. and they look at all the information and the witness statements, and our coroner can subpoena extra information if we need it. And so we meet as a committee once a month, and we make recommendations in a non-blaming way, because we're not trying to blame, everyone has improvements to make, but how they can improve the system to respond to these cases. So I, myself and a colleague, actually wrote the foundation paper for the coroner's office upon which ours was built, and now we serve as members. So I have a long-standing relationship with the coroner's office. I can actually ask them for practically anything now, and because they know me, that's I'm going to get it.
What about the objects of the study, like the
So everything,
offenders?
yes. So everything we do has to be vetted by ethics. So when the coroner every time a student and/or I want to use the data for a different purpose than we've collected it for, we have to submit an application to them. And they look at it and they approve it pending our own ethics application. So and it's really funny, at one point, if you were collecting data, like criminal justice data, particularly around homicide, and the focus of your data collection was dead, they didn't seem to worry, but now they are very concerned about all that kind of stuff. And because the offender is still alive in many of the cases.
Well, also because the dead person might have, has family or...
Yeah. Well, okay, so the answers to that is they do, but there's no identifying information, so their names can't be released. Yeah, so it's all, they give it to us in an aggregate format. Now, because I'm the principal investigator, I get a master file that's kept under lock and key, and it has to be destroyed at the end. So and we sign agreements to this effect, etc. But there's something, and I'd have to go back and ask this. I know that there's something about the coroner that they're allowed to release information to a certain degree in their capacity as the coroner. So that covers them with respect to the victim. With the offender, the coroner's office doesn't often have a lot of information on the offender because they deal with the victim for the most part, and then the police and the courts deal with the offender. But in my role on the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, we can't review cases until the case is actually proceeded through the entire criminal justice system, including appeals. So the case has to be closed, and at that point, we can get access to the data through the powers of the coroner's office, which has the power to subpoena that information. So yes, there's protections in place, and I don't know, I think we all become ethics experts at the end of the day, because I don't know how many ethics applications I've written, and I just keep writing them, but it's an important safeguard about information, particularly actually, ethics was originated around human participants. And in a way, we do have human participants because we have a live offender, and we have the family members of the victims. But now they are sort of moving to safeguard that as well. So then with the Specialized Domestic Violence Court, it took me 2 years to access that data.
Wow.
So we had the evaluation data, which we had got agreement to use, but then we wanted to extend that. So, and it was and this is how there is no direct route. So we met for 2 years with different agencies and worked our way up through the Ministry of Attorney General, which is what it's called in Ontario. And at the end of the day, they said, forget it. So it was 2 years kind of wasted. And as I was leaving the meeting, one of the people that at the meeting came out and said, don't start at the top. Go through your local Crown Attorney's office. And so I went back to Guelph, and I went in and met the local Crown Attorney, and I said, this is what we're trying to do. And 2 weeks later, we had access to the data. So I don't know why. So my short answer to the question of how do you get access to that, I don't think there's one formula. I think it depends on your relationships with people. I think it depends on the agency themselves. I think, you could probably speak to some of this in terms of the criminal justice agencies, I think, are more concerned with confidentiality and privacy than maybe other agencies. But I think one of the things that you said that's important is if 5 people are filling out a form on a particular day, but they see your face, it's a big, like you've met with them, they have some sense of who you are. I think it goes a long way towards moving you just ahead of, a little bit ahead of that person that's just submitting the form and they don't know face.
Yeah.
And a big thing is trust.
Yeah.
So you can tell me, I'll start, but then you can say how it worked with yours. That I've seen people, especially in the United States, I don't think it happens here as much, I'm not sure, but they sometimes go to almost the edge of misleading an organization about what they really want to do. And they're too vague, and they're not explained. So the agencies the Inspector Stewart, was that his name?
Yep.
He explained that, hey, we're open to things that even would make us potentially realize we made a mistake because we want to change it. So that's very open. I was very impressed by that statement. But there's other agencies that aren't that open, and they don't want to admit that they've made a mistake or they're doing something that could be improved. If you got that kind of agency, you got to be careful, but you also have to tell them the truth. And you've got to at least give them the impression that you're giving them at least a neutral perspective when you go in, and you're going to be open-minded and hear what they have to say and get them to explain why they're doing what they're doing and not just jump to conclusions and think it's wrong. And you've got to take what I'll call value-neutral perspective. And they're most good agencies are okay with value-neutral perspective. They don't want you coming in and being anti-police or anti-court system. And
then in the course of your research, you may discover stuff that you hadn't initially planned on when you.
And often my experiences, and all that, she's the main guest, is that students go in with negative perspectives and they think, oh, the police are terrible. And then they go in and learn, well, wait a minute, these people aren't as bad as I thought. And what would I have done? So did you get similar experiences?
Yeah, I totally agree. But actually, if they go in with the perspective that they think the police are bad, they probably won't change that perspective because they won't be looking for anything that will change the way they look.
Some of them don't look at all.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, the concept of trust is really important. And so that is, if you promise to do particular things for an agency to get access to the data, that's your priority.
Yeah.
Beyond your publishing, which sometimes we feel like that's our priority, but priority, if you want to continue having a good relationship with those people that are giving you access to data, which is really a privilege in a way because they don't have to, it is about making sure that you keep them happy too. And I think the sustainability of relationships is important because I started under sort of Rosemary and got access, she was a very well-respected scholar. So I got into the Crown Attorney's office and the Coroner's office, and when I went to want to go back into the Crown Attorney's office to update my data, the person that I worked with was gone. And I was so disappointed because I'm still working to get back in. So that one individual who believed in research and wanted to, help researchers look at particular questions, he was gone. So it speaks to maybe the sustainability of relationships and not putting all your eggs in one basket, maybe making sure that you know a number of people in the organization. But I think, getting access to data is about building trust and about investing time because it does take a long time. But in the end, it's totally worth it because you do end up. Secondary data analysis is great too, but I've always got more satisfaction out of seeing a data set being built from my own work. I think the other thing I should say, I do a lot of quantitative work. We do a lot of interviews with victims too, which is a whole different ball of wax when it comes to ethics and responsibility and integrity of research in terms of when you're interviewing victims, what you should be putting into place for them after you interview them and before you interview them and stuff like that. So I think, that's a very important aspect of the work that I do. And I have students coming to me that start the master's and they say, I want to interview victims about this. And I usually say, no. Have you ever interacted with victims? No. Do you know how to interview victims or do you know what they might have gone through? No. Well, you can't do a research project like that without sort of having some context or training on sensitivity around interviewing vulnerable respondents. Another sort of, I think, challenge of the work that I do is there's a term floating out there called vicarious trauma. Have you ever heard of that? Yeah, so the trauma isn't actually perpetrated, you're not experiencing it directly, but you're experiencing it indirectly. And so I got a really big voice, so I'll just shout.
That's sorry.
That's okay.
There's only our building that construction going on.
When you go through paper file, interviewing victims, I think it's pretty straightforward. You're hearing the stories right from them. You haven't experienced it, but you're experiencing it with them when they're retelling it. So I think you can understand how vicarious trauma could happen if you do that on a repeated basis, because you hear lots of things that you prefer probably never to hear. When you go through paper files, you wouldn't expect actually to feel like that. I remember the first photo envelope I took out, and I saw them, and I thought, I don't need to look at photos to collect data, and I never looked at a photo after that. But even if you're reading the text, And I actually had 2 research assistants quit on me because they said, I can't do this anymore. It's just so depressing. Like, it's affecting the way I interact with my boyfriend, one of them said. The other said, I go out, because we were looking at homicides more generally. She said, I go out at night, and she said, I'm jumping at my shadow. You know, so that was a form of vicarious trauma. And after that, I realized that I hadn't been very responsible. And that I needed to make sure that they had someone to talk to when they were collecting their data. And so we started a little sort of what I call a mini support group of people who had been collecting data for a while and how they dealt with some of the things. And I got some advice from one of my friends who's a counselor. So put some structures in place to prevent that from being as bad as it might have been. And then I guess just 2 other challenges. It's massive information. So you can get a bunch of information, and that's related to the fact that sometimes you forget that you're dealing with real people in real lives, and I think that's really important as a researcher to remember. I'm embarrassed to say this, but I'm going to tell the story anyway. As a graduate student, I was looking up the intimate femicide data, and I was trying to compare intimate femicide suicides to intimate femicides that weren't followed by suicides. And I was walking down the street, and I said to my graduate student buddy, I said, I can't believe it. Like, there's only 10% of suicides. I needed more. And she looked at me and she said, Myrna. And that was such a valuable lesson for me because I was so focused on my data that I forgot that there was real people there. I've never forgotten that again because I'm even embarrassed just telling it now because, you know, it's just you can't forget that those are the people that you got into the research for. I got into the research for Bonnie because of her experiences. So it's remembering who you're doing it for. So I don't know how I'm doing for time.
Get as much as you want.
Okay, well, so you asked me to talk about my current role. I can run through the rest of this fairly quickly because. So my current role is I'm a Canada Research Chair in Public Policy and Criminal Justice, which is a federal government-funded position there's many of them in Canada that are allotted to particular universities. And what it enables me to do is focus more on research than teaching, which is not that I don't like teaching, and I'll come back to that, but I am very sort of research intensive in terms of needing a lot of time to do the research that I do. So I teach in the fall term, and I do research primarily from January to September. And I travel, and so one of the mandates is to do international research. And so I've traveled to Australia quite a bit, and that's one of the reasons why I'm here. And so it's about taking research that occurs in Canada and seeing if you can, sort of spread out and reach out to countries that are similarly situated and doing similar things. So I mentioned the Domestic Violence Death Review Committees. They're happening here in Australia at about the same time as they started to evolve in Canada. And so that's part of what I'm trying to do here is to pair up some of the international work on those. And the other is looking at intimacy and justice and looking at how intimacy is constructed in the Australian courts. If it's different than in Canada, because in Canada, in 1996, we passed a piece of legislation that said judges now have to consider an intimate relationship, whether it be spousal or child, as an aggravating factor at sentencing. Not quite sure it's actually happening that much, but we're looking at it, and that we now have some more data past 1996 that we can see if there's some trends. But they're currently, until the Not Now, Not Ever task force report that came out in Queensland, which I think they've recommended this as an aggravating factor, but it hasn't been in Australia up until this point. So we want to compare, is the situation different in Canada and Australia based on us having the legislation and no legislation existing here.
So does that mean if somebody commits a homicide on their spouse or their partner, then that's more severe than if they committed on a stranger?
They wouldn't say it like that. They would say that if someone, because historically what has happened is if someone's killed a partner, an intimate partner, it's been treated as a more lenient crime, and we have a lot of research to support that. And so they're saying it's an aggravating factor. Not in comparison to a stranger homicide, but within the context of that homicide, when we're tallying up the mitigating and aggravating factors, that has to be counted as aggravating. And so it's forcing judges to sort of grapple with, these are serious cases, even if you feel like they are more understandable than the stranger homicide because of the close relationships, the heightened emotions, and that sort of thing.
Do you think that the culture within Australia is going to change now that we've sort of trying to change that as well in the courts?
By culture, do you mean?
Well, they're bringing out a lot more on TV and through media and everything, saying that violence is not okay and violence against women is particularly on the agenda at the moment in Australia.
I think it will. I don't know if we're going to be able to see it in our lifetime. I think the cultural change is very, very slow. I think Australia has amazing stuff going on now. Like at one time I read a book about 15 or 20 years ago that talked about Australia and Canada in the mid-1990s being like at the height of progress when it comes to responding to violence against women. We've had a current government that we've just overthrown that really made the pendulum swing back. And so we're not doing very well right now, where I see amazing things happening here, which is one of the reasons why I keep coming back here, is because there's so much going on here in terms of proposals for legislative changes and stuff like that. So yes, I think it's going to happen, but I don't know if we're going to see it. Just when I think there's going to be a cultural shift, I step outside my little box, and I don't see as much of a cultural shift. So, but I think it's going to happen.
It's though too, isn't it? Because it's something that just doesn't occur out of the street, so you really never know how far that cultural shift is actually happening.
Well, and the other, yes, you're absolutely correct. And the other thing that happens is because there's these shifts, there's more reporting, which makes it seem like it's more of a problem, when in fact it's always been there, but now people are coming out more. And I met with the two magistrates that are involved in your specialized domestic violence court here in Southport, and they were saying that they were just overwhelmed when the court first opened. They couldn't believe how many cases were coming in. And because no one was sort of hearing about them. You know, the police probably had some of them, but whether or not they proceeded to court depends on a number of factors. And then a lot of them weren't even being reported. So it's very hard. And attitudes are really hard to measure, because we all want to be socially desirable, and answering a question honestly sometimes is difficult. But I think, you know, there's that Chinese proverb, change takes 100 years.
My mum says, all this talk about domestic violence never happened in my day. And I'm like, well, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and I think back, like, and I try to put the situation that happened with my mentor Bonnie happening now. Like, it just would not happen that we would come into a workplace and people would not be trying to help. Like in Ontario, we had a particularly bad homicide that happened in one of the hospitals. An anesthesiologist killed a nurse who didn't want to go out with him anymore. And so now we have occupational health and safety legislation that actually makes employers responsible for assessing risk and helping with safety and stuff like that, which is quite significant. And I'm pretty sure, I want to say South Australia has something similar passed. So, you know, so there are cultural shifts already. I think sometimes if you're living in the moment, it's harder to see, but you're right. If you talk to people who were responding to these things 30 years ago, I think there's a big difference. Yeah. I guess the last thing I want to say is two last things. Teaching, I do research, but I teach, and I love teaching. I teach graduate research methods, and I teach violence in society, and I don't think there's a big divide between teaching and research. I talk about my research all the time in my teaching, and my students like that because it gives them that applicable sort of side to the theories and to the material that we're discussing. And I want to come back to what I started with, the journalism. So if you are considering, and you probably, you know, already do this, but I can't emphasize enough, and I'm sure that you can reinforce this, how good writing can really get you places. And I remember Rosemary saying to me, I really like how you write. She said, you just write simply. Because I was trained as a journalist and we were writing to a grade 8 education, and so we had to write in a way that was accessible to everybody. So it's not that I still write to a grade 8 education. I would probably never get published if I did, but it's about that 5-syllable word. Do I really need it? Or is a 3-syllable word fine? And so I think it's about clarity of writing. And one of the reasons why I think have been able to negotiate the graduate school environment and now the academic environment is because writing has always been the core of what I do. It's been the thing that I love to do the most. And it's a skill that I think we don't value enough now. And it's going to get worse as we get our little 140 words and that's probably texting and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's, you know, if you're moving forward and thinking about moving forward and writing is something you struggle with, don't give up. Just keep working on your writing, because that's going to be one of the things that will make you stand out from the rest of your peers. And I'll just leave it at that. And open it up for questions. And say that you're welcome to come to Canada.
I like seem to be asking all the questions. When you did your honours, did you choose when you applied to do honours, and I'm not sure whether it's the same here, do you choose your topic, or is there a several topics and you are directed into
Okay, so
one.
ours is a little bit different because ours is a 4-year honors degree, so you selected your honors degree from the time that you entered in the first year.
Oh, right.
Now, some people, we do have a 3-year degree, but I think we're actually getting rid of it at the university I'm at. So you select your honors right from the very beginning, and your honors, your 4th-year honors, is what we call a special topics, and we pick it ourselves. Now, having said that, you need to find someone that's able to supervise you and has a bit of knowledge in that area. And so what most of us ended up doing was, if you had a prof that you really liked their course, or you had a prof that talked about a research that they were doing that you thought would be interesting, you often went. I had some colleagues that went and said, is there any questions in that project that you think would be something that I could do my honors thesis on? Or this is what I'm thinking about doing. Do you feel like you're capable of supervising a thesis like that? So one of the students I currently have did an honors thesis with me on domestic violence among police officers. So she was really interested because police officers, 4 times the rate, domestic violence in police officers compared to the general population, US stats. We don't have any in Canada. And it just so happened at the time that I had just reviewed a case for the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee on a retired police officer who had killed his partner. And the retired aspect was part of it too, but the fact that she couldn't get help made her kind of a vulnerable population because she was reaching out to his former colleague. So Danielle came to me prior to her 4th year and said, I'd really like to do something on this. And I said, well, I'm just reviewing this case right now. How about we look at what police jurisdictions or police agencies actually have in place for police who are experiencing or perpetrating domestic violence? And so that's the project she did. So that's how it's done in Canada. You can sort of speak to what happens here.
Wow. I don't know.
No, the honors thesis.
Oh, the honors.
I think you need more pizza.
How about if I say this, that the real specifics of honors, we're going to have special honors nights later on in September.
I did say that.
But you're asking a very good question, and the best way I could answer it, I think, is give you an example that we do have honors students who will come to the honors convener, the person in charge of honors, and say, I want to do honors. What type of research do you want to do? Well, I'm not sure. And they will accept those applications. But if they're looking and comparing you with somebody else, what makes you stand out is pretty much what Professor Olga said, that have you already looked into this during your first 3 years? Do you have a topic already? Have you maybe even volunteered for some project? Now, it's certainly not mandatory. Most people do not. But what really makes you stand out is you've got a nice, clean title and a clear description of what you want to do, and that you've already talked to somebody about this. And it's kind of your idea that you've now maybe even gone back and forth once or twice with the potential supervisor, and they've said, yeah, that's a really good idea, but maybe you need to change this one little thing, and you kind of already got that down. And that's the ideal thing.
I guess all of that, when you're an online student, is really difficult because you don't make the connections, within the whole school.
Well, it may not be as difficult as you think. So, for example, if you're taking a course, I'll give you just an example from my course. I teach a victimology course, and there's several themes that I heard today that we talk about in class. Vicarious victimization, we talk about. There's a couple other different things. Let's say you were interested in that area, and during the course that you were taking online, you email the convener and say, hey, I'm really interested in this. I've got to write a paper. I'm thinking about writing a paper on this, but I also want to go to honors. And that's kind of the key thing, because when we hear that, then we may pay a little bit more attention to it.
Only got 5 weeks to go.
Well,
It's never too
I
late.
understand, but it's not too late. But the idea is, I'm interested in this thing. Maybe I can kind of get myself started by writing the paper in your class, and then maybe it'll give me some more ideas as I'm collecting my information for literature review and so forth. So I always like to tell people to try to maximize their efforts by making the effort in one class also be applicable someplace else, which would be, like an honors application. Now you've only got 5 weeks, so but maybe if you still have a paper that's not due till later, right? No? Okay. You're not writing any more papers this semester.
I'm doing one, which is the risk assessment.
But it doesn't have anything to do with what you're interested in for honors. But that's okay. Then you can still get an idea. You want to talk to potential honor supervisors in advance, meaning look at the staff pages and see who has research that's in this area, and then try to strike up a conversation with them, either by email or potentially in person if you can get to campus, and get their feedback right away.
And if I could just jump in there, like, just because you haven't done a paper doesn't mean you couldn't, like, I don't know what they do here, but in the master's program in Canada, you get a statement of interest, and it's only about a page, but it gives you, you could sort of, in a page, put something together that would give the prof or the convener or whatever an idea of where you're going. It doesn't have to be a full, in this situation, like if you have 5 weeks, I wouldn't say you'd need necessarily a full paper, but an idea, so that they know you have.
I kind of know what my field of interest is.
Yeah, so put together, a well-written thing that you can.
Often what I find, which is just elaboration about what we've already said, is students have these really good ideas sometimes, but sometimes there's just one little tweak that's necessary to make it make more sense. Yeah. And if they can get with somebody who's experienced in this area, then they can help them with that little tweak. And then all of a sudden something, when you write down like what the title is of the research you want to do in honors, whereas before somebody's looking at this and thinking, wait a minute, I don't understand this. If they tell you this little tweak in it, it all of a sudden makes it perfectly clear, because that's what they're there for, is to give you this advice based upon all this experience and knowledge. If they give you this little tweak, all of a sudden your thing that kind of looks vague is now like polished. And I don't know what we have in our honors applications. I haven't seen them, but there's going to be a title and maybe a paragraph, I think. That maybe
I'm not sure about that, but I know
maybe
that
not even
students
that
are
much.
encouraged to certainly seek out a supervisor.
Yeah, seek out the supervisor as soon as you can, and give them your general idea. And you want to, I think I've told this to other people, you want to give the supervisor the impression that you've done enough homework, that you've kind of narrowed things down, but also give them the impression that you're here to get their feedback on how to make this perfect or better, or give them some ideas. Because often the students won't get something and then they get offended if somebody says, well, why don't you change this? When, after they go through and they find out why they're being told to change, they're, oh, okay, now I get it. If that makes any sense. So do it as soon as you can, and be flexible enough or open enough to that feedback, and encourage them to give you feedback.
Yeah, well, that's what you want, isn't it?
Well, yes, but sometimes the students don't do that. And it's usually not this type of students who are here today. It's the ones that don't want to do honors. They get offended if they're told, well, why don't you change something here? And you don't want to be in that position. You want to, ask and be flexible and say, I think this is what I want. I'm pretty sure this is it. And get some feedback right away. And then be willing to change it a couple times.
The reality is you might go in with a set idea and approach of how you want to do your research, but then the limitations surrounding how you can actually do it, go about doing it, you won't know until you're actually, working with a supervisor who's got experience in that.
Oh,
Yeah.
Definitely. So the limitations is one, and then the other thing is that they may know that the one thing that you want to do, or you think you want to do, has been done 10 million times before. And they can tell you, yes, but, you can either do this thing that somebody's already published 2,000 papers on it, or you could change this one little thing and no one's done this. And then all of a sudden you've got this, it goes from a mediocre idea to a wonderful idea just from the feedback.
And what about doing it in another country? Can you even go about that?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Well, you apply,
Yeah.
but you know, Guelph is. I think most universities now are big on bringing in international students. I know that there's different fee rates for international students, which is
Yeah.
something that always has to be considered.
Yeah.
But you know, definitely. I realize I'm being taped, so I can send you information.
But there might be an age limit with some of those, so yeah.
You mean a cap?
Yeah, an age
Okay.
limit. Like for example, the Rhodes Scholarship. You can only
Yes.
do it until you're 25.
Yeah.
That's
So-
like a school kind of thing, like the Rhodes.
Oh, that's also for university, like postgraduate.
Oh,
Yeah. But so that's, you've got to sort of look into it. So it's, unless you want to fork it out of your own pocket, yeah, scholarship's a good way to go if you're looking at postgraduate overseas. Yeah.
And I don't know, like, what happens here, but I think, like, even if you did a program here, let's say, and you wanted to do a year in another country because you had an interest in comparing between different countries, there's exchange programs and stuff that I think are in place that wouldn't have the big fees, but you'd have a chance to be exposed to a different culture or environment.
I know of students who've come through, done undergraduate straight within school, and then applied for PhD, and the scholarships can go over different universities. So we had one student who, one of her main supervisors was actually in the UK, and then she had other partners here within the school, and so that gave her a very broad topic, and she had really great data collection from her UK professor. So that was certainly something to look
Was
at
that
as
done
well.
like here in Australia? But she was connected with a supervisor in the UK.
Yep. So she actually spent some time over there with him, and then he travels out here at least once a year to meet as a group. So they have that face-to-face conversation, but she's talking to him all the time as well.
So have we convinced you?
I think for me, it's the limitations of where I want to go, because I'm passionate about child protection and foster carers, and it's a fine line because I'm already a foster carer. I know the information we can get is so limited, so it's trying to work out how I can work within those guidelines.
I think, in this area, I think that, most of us are dealing with pretty vulnerable groups, and can't get much more vulnerable than children, and especially foster children. But it's a lot of discussion going around about it now, and there's different, looking at. I'm thinking of an article that I had in one of my courses that looked at foster care across a number of different countries and what their regulations were in terms of best practices. So what do other countries do with respect to foster care and children in care, and how can that be policy transferred to another country? So there's ways to get at the issues that are responsible and that you can do something without actually sort of trying to access the quagmire of getting access to the individuals themselves. But it's a very important topic.
Yeah.
We actually, on our homicide data collection form, we actually have foster care as a variable that we collect for the offender, because it came up in a lot of cases where the individual had been in foster care, and so that was one of the variables that we added sort of in the midst of the data collection because it was coming up so frequently. So there's a lot of later life outcomes that are very important and that are not good for foster children because of exactly what you're talking about.
Yes.
But in terms of the university ethics, I've found that Griffith ethics here is very helpful.
Okay.
And much more helpful and much more realistic, I think, than my old university in the United States. And I call them up and I say, here's what I'm trying to do and what can you tell me? And they'll explain to me how to go about doing it in the proper way. And then I write it up and send it to them and they approve it.
Because typically they want you to be approved. They just want you.
Here,
Yeah.
I think that they're clear
And
about that. Yes.
and I think, and my university would be the same way. They want you to be able to get your project approved by ethics, and they'll help you do that in a way that won't make anybody unsafe.
Right.
Thank you.
Other questions? Nothing? Sure. Well, I guess we should just thank Professor Dawson
Thank
for
you.
his time.
And actually,
Sure.
I'm fine if you want to give out my email address if people have any questions afterwards or anything.
You don't want that?
No, not at all. I can give it right now if you.
Well, I'll stick it on the Facebook page, and then you'll have it written down.
But thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for your time.